Making the neck for a guitar is complicated, but I'm going to share my secrets, don't tell anyone, to making one that plays great and is easy to assemble. First up, I've got to cut down this maple and hickory to rough length. I also check for knots or cracks that will weaken the neck because, fun fact, did you know that once a guitar is strung up, the neck will be under about 90 pounds of force? So probably not the best time to be using a board with a big old knot in it. Over at the joiner, I make one edge of each board flat so that I have a straight edge to run along the table saw fence when I rip all the boards to rough width. At the table saw, I rip the boards, leaving about a ½ inch of extra material than I need for the final dimensions of my neck blank. Before I plane these boards to final thickness, I first need to make sure that one surface is flat with the joiner. If I skip this step, then the boards won't be straight and true after I run them through the planer. While I mill these boards down to about 7/8 of an inch thickness, I'm again continuing to examine the grain for any defects or tear out that may show up while I'm planing the boards. I wanted the hickory pieces in this neck to be an accent strip at about 3/16 of an inch wide, so rather than just planing away a ton of material, I head over to the bandsaw and get set up to do a little bit of resawing. When resawing thinner stock, I really like using this push block from Microjig. The hooks on the end drop into place right when I need them, and they give me a secure grip on the material that I'm working with. To clean up any minor tear out left behind from the planer and to give the boards a rougher surface for the glue to bond to, I run everything through the drum sander next. I also sand the hickory to final thickness as it's way too thin to run through the planer after having been resawn. I know this is going to be a bit of a rushed glue up. To make things as quick as possible, I go ahead and stack the boards in the order I want them to be laminated. And rather than precisely spreading the perfect amount of glue onto each piece, I just pour right out of the bottle and quickly spread it around with a small squeegee. Once the last piece is on the stack, it goes into a small army of clamps while the glue cures. While I finish putting the squeeze on these boards, I want to take a quick minute and tell you about the sponsor of this video. Bessie Tools has been a mainstay in my shop for years, and their clamps are a big part of what keeps things running smoothly. Easy operation and dependable performance makes multi-piece glue ups like this one go smoothly. If you've never tried out Bessie clamps, you won't go wrong with their K-body Revos or trigger clamps. I have links for both of these in the sizes I use most often in the description below. With the neck blanks out of clamps, I need to mill them down to final thickness before starting the machining operations on the CNC. So it's back over to the joiner to clean up one surface and then over to the planer again to bring the blank down to the final thickness required for the machining operations I've programmed for the CNC. Okay, so now it's time to let the CNC work its magic, turning this piece of wood into a guitar neck. And if you're wondering how all of this is staying in place, it's actually being sucked to the table with a giant vacuum. There's more on that in the first video in the series. On the left, you'll see that I made a test neck out of pine so that in case I make a boo-boo programming the CNC, I don't ruin a chunk of wood I've just spent 8 hours making. I spent 18 years of my life making guitar necks completely by hand. So figuring out how to have the CNC do all of this work is brand new to me. And what you're watching right now is my very first attempt. So let's see what happens. Whoops! Turns out when I cut the test neck that was made of pine, I forgot to adjust the speeds and feeds for cutting maple and hickory, which are much more dense than pine is. Because of this, the vacuum couldn't hold it in place. So let's give it another shot with things slowed down just a little bit. Next up, I cut a slot for the truss rod so that the neck can be adjusted. Now it's time to show you two of my favorite parts of the neck. The first one is these two slots that will make sure that the neck and body are in perfect alignment when it's time to glue them together. The second one is these tiny holes that will line up the fretboard with the neck when it's time for glue. You'll see how all this works in just a minute. Alright, now it's time to flip over the pancake and work on the other side. To me, watching the finishing pass is pretty neat. It has the same kind of cool factor that turning a bowl on a wood lathe does. Just seeing the final shape emerge underneath the raw material is fun to witness. Okay y'all, it's the final cut and things are looking good. If you're wondering why I haven't cut out the headstock, it's because I chose to do that later on the bandsaw by hand. It could have been done on the CNC, but I'd have to make another jig, and honestly it's just faster to do it by hand at this point. Something I like to do to add a little rigidity to the heel area of the neck is to drive 2 carbon fiber dowels in at an angle. This isn't completely necessary, but it does make a noticeable difference in the amount that the neck flexes.
Dude, don't mess this up.
To give myself a fighting chance at not drilling all the way through, I wrap some tape around the drill bit to serve as a depth gauge, so that way I know when to stop. With the holes drilled, I scuff up 2 pieces of carbon fiber with some 120 grit sandpaper and slather them with a bit of Total Boat high performance epoxy to secure them in place. Once the epoxy is fully cured, I cut off the excess with a hacksaw and then file it down. Before I'm finished with this part of the neck, I grab my small carving chisels and I make a few minor adjustments to the slot where the truss rod is going to be. If the slot is too tight, you run the risk of the truss rod binding in the slot. But if it's too loose when it gets installed, then as you play the guitar, it'll rattle, and nobody wants that. So I make the fit just right. Now it's time to make the fretboard, and this is a step I've been really excited about having the CNC tackle. I'm starting with a blank of curly maple that's about 1/4 inch thick and just slightly oversized. So let's get this fretboard profiled. Now here's where the fun really begins. You see that tiny end mill that's being loaded right now? That's a 23 thousandths diameter end mill, and it's going to be cutting the fret slots for me. Now, you may or may not be as excited as I am about this, but up until now, all the fretboards I've made, I've slotted with a handsaw. It's not the most difficult process in the world, but it is a bit mundane. So to have the CNC do this for me, well,
I'm so excited!
Remember those holes I drilled earlier that I said were going to help align the fretboard? Well, now it's time to drill the mating holes on the fretboard. Since they line up centered on the fret slots, once the frets are actually installed, these locating holes are going to be covered up and no one will ever know. Well, except for you. It'll be our secret. The final step for this fretboard is to cut for the inlay dots. For this guitar, I went with standard dot markers, but obviously the sky's the limit now that I have a CNC to make all kinds of fancy patterns. All right, check it out. A fretboard fresh off the machine. Now it's time to glue some more stuff together. Unlike when I glued up the neck blank where more glue is better, here I want to be rather particular about how much glue I use. I definitely want to keep it off the truss rod, so to help prevent this, I run a narrow strip of tape over the truss rod and spread out a thin layer of glue. Then with the 16th diameter pins already stuck into the fretboard and kind of pre-positioned, I remove that strip of tape and I locate the fretboard onto the neck. After a quick check to make sure that everything is lined up where it's supposed to be, I go to town with the trigger clamps and set the neck aside for the glue to cure. With the neck out of clamps, it's time to refine the contours left by the CNC. I hold the neck to my workbench with some track clamps, and I start off my sanding session with some cloth-backed 80 grit sandpaper. And if you like the looks of this workbench and want to check out how I built it, you can check out the card that just popped up above for the build video on how I made it. It's been a huge addition to the shop and is super easy to work at. With most of the neck sanded to 120 grit, I temporarily adhere some scrap blocks to the back of the headstock with my favorite blue painter's tape and Starbond glue trick. Basically, you just put 2 layers of tape on opposite pieces, a little bit of CA glue on one piece, a little bit of Accelerated on the other piece, smack them together, and there you go. So I put that block on the back of the headstock so that way I can cut the profile of the headstock parallel to the table on the bandsaw.
You may be thinking that you missed something. When did I make that headstock veneer that's now being used as a guide to cut out the headstock profile on the bandsaw? Well, I'm gonna cover that in a separate video because there's some inlay work and other details that I wanna talk about in a little bit more depth. So, as you were.
At the drill press, I set up with a Forstner bit and I drill out the pilot holes that were cut into the headstock veneer for the tuners. I make sure to have a clean section of plywood underneath the headstock so that way I don't accidentally chip out the backside while I'm drilling these holes. In preparation to sand the headstock contour smooth, I adhere another scrap block using my blue tape and Starbond method. Then using my oscillating sander, I slowly shape the headstock and I blend that transition area between the headstock and neck, and I stop every so often just to make sure I'm not removing too much material and making a boo-boo. Back at my workbench, I clamp the neck down and I put a micro tip on a bottle of Starbond's thin flexible glue to secure these mother of pearl fret markers in place and not just blob glue all over the place. I started off by using a rolled up piece of tape to help place these dots real accurately on the fretboard, but I quickly abandoned that and threw caution to the wind, risking grave injury to gluing my fingers together or even worse, to the fretboard itself.
You're crazy.
After a shot of accelerator to activate the glue, I grab a radiused sanding block that matches the radius on the fretboard, and I level the fret markers. I then sand the entire fretboard up to 180 grit in preparation for installing the frets. There are a couple of different ways to install frets, but the method I use is with a fret press caul jucked up into my drill press. Oh, and make sure it's unplugged first. With all of my pieces of fret wire cut a bit longer than needed, I use a tool called a fret tang nipper, which is one of the funnest tools to talk about, to remove the fret tang on both ends of the wire, so that way the frets can be properly pressed into the slots. I slowly work my way down the fretboard, making sure that each fret is fully seated into the slots. And if a fret isn't fully seated, it'll require a bit of leveling later on to remove fret buzz, which is caused when a string rubs against a high fret. With all of the frets installed, I grab a pair of cutters and trim the fret wire as close as possible to the neck. I then grab a standard flat file and I file the edges flush with both sides of the fretboard before adding about a 15-degree bevel to the end of all of the frets with this same flat file. Then I grab a fret end dressing file and round the ends of all of the frets. So once both the top and bottom of a fret are done, I switch things over to the other side of the neck and just repeat the process.
This video is part of a series. If you haven't caught the other ones, make sure to hit the playlist right here so you don't miss a thing. If you have any comments or questions, leave those below and let's chat. Until next time, let the sawdust fly and have fun making something.